The Daggers of Prague, A Story of Heroic Vengeance, Part 1. The Architect of Fear in the Winter of 1941. The city of Prague was a jewel encased in ice. It's not the ice of winter, but the chilling, suffocating ice of tyranny. The ancient cobblestones of the old town square, which had once echoed with the vibrant chatter of a free people, now resounded with the metronomic, unnerving clap of hobnailed jackboots. Heydrich's mission was to crush the burgeoning Czech resistance and harness the nation's industrial might for the German war machine. He paired terror with enticement, increasing rations for factory workers and providing social benefits to ensure their compliance, while simultaneously orchestrating the systematic deportation of Jews to the ghettos and death camps. He drove through Prague in his unarmored, open-topped dark green Mercedes-Benz, often with minimal security. They needed to prove to the world, and more importantly to their own people, that the spirit of resistance was not dead. They needed to strike a blow that would resonate from Prague to London, Washington, and Moscow. This was not carelessness. It was a calculated display of power and contempt. They were not just killing a man. They were attacking the very idea of Nazi invincibility. They needed to find men who understood this. Men with the skill, the courage, and the cold, unwavering resolve to see it through. They needed to forge 2 daggers and send them flying across the English Channel, aimed directly at the iron heart of the Butcher of Prague. They were ordinary soldiers, forged into something extraordinary by war and duty. They were Warrant Officer Jozef and Staff Sergeant Jan Kubiš. He was demonstrating that he, an agent of the master race, had no need to fear the subhuman Slavs he ruled. He was untouchable, a god in a city of insects. The SO instructors, veterans of their own silent wars, were blunt. Survival was not the objective, success was. They were being trained not just to kill, but to die. In the long, dark Scottish nights, Gab and Kubiš made their peace with this reality. They swore an oath, not just to their country, but to each other. They would complete the mission or die trying. There was no other path. The tight bend in the road where the streetcar tracks made a sharp turn would force Heydrich's powerful Mercedes to slow to a crawl. They saw the posters with Heydrich's face plastered all over the city. They saw the fear in the eyes of the people who helped them. They knew the terrible price their country would pay if they succeeded. Yet their resolve never wavered. They were the daggers forged in London, and they were poised to strike. The street was filled with the mundane sounds of a city at work. The rumble of a streetcar, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant clang of a factory. The assassins stood motionless, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. This was the culmination of everything to escape from their homeland. The training in Scotland, the perilous months in hiding. He squeezed the trigger. It was an ideal ambush point, a natural chokehold. Here, at this specific bend in the road, they would make their stand. He arrived in Prague not as a ruler, but as an exterminator. He immediately declared martial law. Instead of ordering his driver to accelerate and escape, his predator's instinct took over. Enraged at the audacity of the attack, he stood up in the car, drew his Luger pistol, and shouted at Klein to stop. He was the hunter, not the hunted. They boarded a Halifax bomber at an RAF airfield, their faces blackened with cork, their pockets filled with forged papers and cyanide capsules. As the plane droned over the blacked-out continent, they sat in silence, each man alone with his thoughts. It was a perfect throw, but it fell short, landing not inside the car but against the rear right wheel. They were hidden by the brave priests of the Orthodox Church, who knew they were signing their own death warrants. Overwhelmed by fear for his family and tempted by the massive reward, he walked into Gestapo headquarters and told them everything he knew. For 3 weeks, the 7 men lived like ghosts beneath the church, listening to the sounds of the city above the sirens, the announcements of executions, knowing they were the cause of it all, yet holding firm to their duty. The 3 paratroopers in the main church, including Kubiš, held off the initial assault for hours, fighting with pistols from the choir loft until they were overwhelmed by superior firepower and grenades. The SS tried to storm the narrow entrance, but were repeatedly driven back. They tried to flush them out with tear gas. They brought in fire trucks and began pumping water into the crypt through the ventilation shaft, trying to drown them. Horrified by the Lidas massacre, the Allied powers, led by Britain and France, formally repudiated the Munich Agreement, recognizing Czechoslovakia's pre-1938 borders. They were, and are, revered as national heroes, martyrs who willingly sacrificed themselves in a national act of vengeance. They were the Daggers of Prague, sent to excise a cancer from the heart of their nation. And in their final, defiant stand, they bought back their country's honor with their lives. The assassination sent a shockwave through the Reich, shattering the myth of Nazi invincibility. It proved that even the most powerful men of the Third Reich were mortal. Kubiš, severely wounded, died shortly after being captured. The manhunt began, led by the Gestapo, a furious, wounded beast. A reward of 10 million crowns was offered for information. From within the flooding, lightless crypt, they returned fire, their defiance echoing in the stone chamber. In a calculated act of collective punishment, the Gestapo descended on the mining village of Lidas, which they falsely claimed had aided the assassins. All 192 men of the village were shot. The women were sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. The children were gassed, save for a few deemed racially suitable for Germanization. The village itself was burned to the ground and leveled until not one stone was left upon another. A few days later, the village of La, which had harbored a resistance radio, met the same fate. They knew there was no escape. When their ammunition ran low, they used their last bullets on themselves. They had fulfilled their vow. They had died fighting, denying the enemy the satisfaction of capture. The reprisals started almost immediately, a wave of terror designed to break the will of the city. Thousands were arrested and executed. The blast ripped through the right side of the vehicle, embedding fragments of metal and horsehair upholstery from the car seat deep into Heydrich's body. Below them lay their homeland, a place they loved so much they were returning to it to die. Prague shimmered in the late spring sunlight. For Gab and Kubiš, it was the day the world would end. He and Klein both fired their pistols at the fleeing assassins. But then, as he tried to give chase, a look of shock crossed his face. He staggered, clutched his side, and collapsed against the bonnet of the car, mortally wounded. The iron heart had been pierced not by a bullet, but by the debris of his own armored chariot. Dressed in trench coats, their hats pulled low, they took up their positions near the hairpin turn. Gab K stood on the outer curve of the bend, the disassembled Sten gun hidden in a briefcase. Kubiš stood a little further back on the opposite side, his coat concealing the powerful anti-tank grenades. A third man, Jozef Val, acted as a lookout, positioned up the road to signal Heydrich's approach with a small mirror. They were entirely reliant on the local resistance for intelligence, for food, for their very existence. They were two men against the entire security apparatus of the Reich. They studied Heydrich's daily routine, a task of terrifying risk. Heydrich was in the passenger seat, his SS driver, Klein, at the wheel. The moment was surreal. The monster, the butcher of Prague, was there just a few yards away, a man of flesh and blood, vulnerable. They discovered his single point of vulnerability, his arrogant, predictable commute from his villa in the suburbs to his office at Prague Castle. President Edvard Benes and his fiercely capable intelligence chief, Brigadier General František Moravec, saw their nation being systematically broken. Dropped miles off course due to a navigational error, they parachuted into the frozen, snow-covered countryside near Prague instead of their intended drop zone near Plzeň. Gab K injured his foot on landing. They were separated from their equipment, including the crucial grenades, which they spent hours searching for in the deep snow. They were alone, wounded and vulnerable in the heart of enemy territory. He was compact, fiery, and possessed of a fierce, unyielding patriotism. They made contact with a local farmer who risked his own life and his family's to give them shelter. This was the beginning of their life in the underground. For 5 months, they moved like phantoms through a network of safe houses in Prague. They were hidden by teachers, doctors, and factory workers' patriots who knew that harboring them meant an automatic death sentence. He was a natural leader, his determination a gravitational force that pulled others along. Kubiš was a Czech, more reserved and quiet, with a thoughtful, almost gentle demeanor that concealed a core of absolute steel. They were friends, bound by the shared experience of escaping their occupied homeland to fight for its freedom. They were two halves of a single weapon. Their intelligence networks were silent, their people paralyzed by fear. Here, they were stripped of the conventions of traditional warfare and taught the dark arts of the clandestine operative. They learned to kill silently with a knife, to handle explosives, to master the intricacies of sabotage and tradecraft. They memorized codes, practiced forging documents, and learned how to live as ghosts in a hostile land. To their allies, Britain and the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia appeared to be a pacified, compliant part of the Reich. An especially modified anti-tank grenade powerful enough to destroy a car, but light enough to be thrown accurately. These were to be their tools of retribution. The plan he proposed was not a military operation. It was a targeted assassination, a suicide mission. It would be called Operation Anthropoid. The name was clinical, almost biological, masking the terrifying reality of what it entailed. Sending a handful of men into the heart of the Nazi Empire to kill a monster with almost no chance of survival. This was a narrative they could not allow to stand. Arrests, tortures, and executions became daily events. He was chillingly effective. The resistance networks were shattered, the people cowed into submission. But to kill Heydrich, the untouchable God King, the architect of fear himself, would be a statement of profound defiance. It would be a national act of retribution, a message written in the blood of one of the Reich's most powerful men. He became known by many names: the Blonde Beast, the Hangman, and, most enduringly, the Butcher of Prague. The Charles Bridge, its statues of saints staring blankly, was a crossing point for Gestapo patrols. Fear was the city's air, suspicion its currency. This cold, pervasive terror had a source, an architect whose name was spoken only in fearful whispers. He was SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich was not merely a governor or a general. He was the living embodiment of the Nazi ideal, a terrifying fusion of intellect, ambition, and absolute ruthlessness. Tall, blonde, with piercing blue eyes and the chiseled features of an Aryan knight, he was a gifted musician, a champion fencer, and a man who possessed what Hitler himself admiringly called an iron heart. As the head of the Reich Main Security Office, he was the chief of the Gestapo, the Kripo, and the SD, the central nervous system of the Nazi terror state. He was the man who had chaired the Wannsee Conference, where the final solution to the Jewish question was formalized with the bloodless, bureaucratic efficiency of a corporate meeting. In September 1941, he was appointed Deputy Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia. The previous protector was deemed too soft. His rule was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. Far away, in the damp, gray confines of London, the Czechoslovak government-in-exile watched in horror and impotence. They needed to act. They needed a gesture so audacious, so dramatic, that it would shatter the illusion of Czech submission. The target was obvious. To kill a low-level official would be pointless. To bomb a factory would be ineffective. Moravec convened a meeting with his top officers. This would not be an act of rage. It would be a calculated political act of vengeance. Part 2. The forging of the daggers the men selected for Operation Anthropoid were not supermen. Gabčík was a Slovak, a locksmith by trade before the war. Their transformation from soldiers to assassins took place in the bleak, windswept landscapes of Scotland at the secret training schools of the British Special Operations Executive. Their primary training centered on two pieces of equipment: a British Sten submachine gun, a crude but effective weapon that could be broken down and easily concealed. The psychological toll of the training was immense. Every lesson, every drill was undertaken with the cold knowledge that this was a one-way mission. On the night of December 28, 1941, the time came. The jump was a nightmare. Their survival depended on the courage of ordinary people, the invisible army of the Czech resistance. From a cramped apartment in the city, they began the painstaking work of planning the assassination. They scouted locations, settling on a sharp hairpin turn in the Holocaust district. The geography was perfect. The months of waiting were an agony of tension. They lived with a constant fear of betrayal, the gnawing anxiety of the coming confrontation. Part 3. The Strike at the Turning Point. The morning of May 27, 1942, dawned bright and clear. The minutes crawled by like hours. At Shawu Shidan Senshifen, Val S. Mira flashed the signal. Heydrich's open-topped green Mercedes was approaching. The car slowed as it entered the turn, just as they had predicted. Gabčík stepped from the shadows of the streetcar stop. He dropped the briefcase, grabbed the Sten gun, and took aim at the car. Click, nothing. The gun had jammed. It was the ultimate nightmare, the one known failure at the one moment that mattered. Time seemed to freeze. Heydrich and Klein stared at Gab in stunned disbelief. In this critical moment, Heydrich made his fatal mistake. That single, arrogant decision sealed his fate. As the car braked to a halt, it presented a perfect, stationary target for the second assassin. Jan Kubiš, seeing Gab's gun fail, acted without hesitation. He stepped forward and lobbed his grenade. The explosion was deafening. A geyser of black smoke and shrapnel erupted, shattering the car's windows and blowing a hole in its side. For a moment, Heydrich remained standing, seemingly unharmed, his face a mask of fury. In the ensuing chaos, Gab and Kubiš managed to escape, splitting up and disappearing into the labyrinthine streets of Prague. The Nazi response was immediate and savage. Prague was locked down. A state of emergency was declared. The assassins, along with 5 other paratroopers who had been sent on other missions, found their final refuge in the dark, cold crypt of the St. Cyril and Methodius Cathedral. The end came through betrayal. One of their own, a fellow paratrooper named Karol Korda, broke under the pressure. On the morning of June 18th, 700 SS soldiers surrounded the cathedral. The battle began. The remaining 4, including Gab, were barricaded in the crypt below. For hours, the 4 men held off an army. The Nazi revenge for Heydrich's death was horrific. It was a terrible price. But the mission was, in its own brutal way, a success. Jozef, Gab, and Jan Kubiš were never seen as assassins by their people.